with a, thank you, with a PhD in educational leadership and international education. So when did you start that, Nidal?
Hi, Alex, and good morning, everyone. Lovely to see so many familiar faces in the room. And thanks to Tristan and Alex for this invitation. I started my PhD research back in 2018. So it's been quite a while since then.
That's great. Yeah, I was similar with my PhD. I think I started in 2012 and I concluded in 2018. Everybody, when they start a PhD, I'm sure you're in this right now, Ian, is always in a rush to get them done, aren't they? You're always like, yeah, because it's always often linked with a bit of career progression as well, isn't it? So you actually want to get it done. But I don't know if you're the same, Nidal. I found that once I was doing it, I got to a stage when part of me didn't want it to end anymore, and part of it just wanted it to be over. How did you feel about that?
I just enjoyed so much that research process, and I kept learning things and I can say unlearning other things as well. So I found myself engaging in other projects, like side projects. One of them was with the University of Cambridge Center for Lebanese Studies, where I looked at leadership of Lebanese public school principals. Then after that, I spotted a job, an advert by the British Academy for researchers who would be looking at leadership in Iraq. And I'm so interested in the policy and leadership dynamics in the Middle East. So I applied and I got that job. So started my postdoc about a year ago. And I feel like I am enjoying this process so much. I'm not sure I would really want to go back to the workplace. It was so exhausting, as many of the leaders in this room would know. And I think it's exciting. There's no certainty though, but it's really exciting.
That's fantastic. Yeah, you just reminded me something I forgot that I'm also doing. I'm writing a book on educational leadership in the climate crisis. And what you just said resonates, because I'm writing this book to say to educational leaders, you have this really important role of responsibility in shaping the futures of people. And then it just came to mind again, yeah, but they're doing so many other things at the same time as well. And it seems like for ed leaders, the responsibility of the world is weighed upon them every single day. You are responsible for everything. And here's one more thing you're responsible for: climate change. So it's a crazy situation. You're right. Now I'm going to hand over now to Tristan, who's going to introduce a little bit your PhD work. And then afterwards, Tristan is going to hand over to you to present to us, please, on that.
Yeah, thank you. So thanks, Alex. So as I said, I had the pleasure of being the external examiner for Nidal's PhD at UCL just before Christmas. And what struck me the most about Nidal's work was the way that it was raising questions that we've only just really sort of started to explore about how prepared are Western trained leaders. They might be prepared for leading a school, but are they prepared for leading an international school in a non-Western context? And I think that is something that we're only really just starting to explore about how prepared the leaders are and what training do they need and what schools, we know that the schools are complex, evolving, loosely linked systems. And international schools are especially complex. They're especially loosely linked. They're especially complex systems. And when you're being a leader of an international school in a non-Western context, in the instance of Nidal's work for instance, in Qatar, in the Middle East, that's especially complex. And increasingly, more leaders are working in what we might call non-traditional international schools, which are especially complex and especially loosely linked and have their own tensions and challenges. So I think there's a whole area there that's only just really been, we're only sort of just really discovering. As you might expect, looking at international schools as social and cultural fields of power, Nidal draws on Bourdieu, and I think increasingly we're doing that, although there's still a lot of tools in the social fields theory box that we could probably tap into. And increasingly here at Bath, I see students using Foucault. So we're starting to draw on sociological theory much more. And I think that's been a big development in regards to research on leadership in international schools. It's only recently we've really started using any sort of theoretical concepts. And you know, there's other concepts that we could probably draw upon beyond sociology. And I think that's probably where the field is going to start moving, hopefully fairly soon. So at that point, I'll stop there and introduce and let Nidal carry on. So Nidal, do you want to do your?
Yeah, thank you so much, Tristan. I'm going to start sharing my screen. Okay, let me just. I hope it's clear for everybody. And as Tristan and Alex mentioned, my work focused on international school leadership in Qatar and England. So I'm starting with this beautiful photo, not because it's one of the areas in my PhD research, but just to throw up around some bit of reflection on the field. So this is a photo of beautiful birds migrating, and birds migrate for different reasons, obviously for food, for warmth, and mainly for survival. People move too, sometimes for similar reasons, but not always. So the experiences of people moving from the global south to the global north is to a great extent different from the experiences and the reasons behind the migration of people going in the opposite direction. So I would like to leave these two questions with you as we dig into this dense presentation. Why are international schools flourishing globally? And what makes them desirable? So you might say it's about doing well financially or making good impact, but what does that mean and why? And why is it really desirable? And I spoke in my thesis about the desirability phenomena. And then what is the wider and local social impact of international schools? So when we think of these communities living in massively lavish lifestyles, do we really make any connections with a massive or devastating size of inequities and inequalities in the same regions and probably in the same countries? So I would really like us to really reflect on that kind of connection. But because thinking about international school, at least from my own lens, that is quite a sociological lens, cannot really think about international schools just as in within the school. I do look outside the school and beyond the school. And I hope my upcoming presentation of my own research would make some sense. I looked at 4 interconnected areas. How do international schools in England and Qatar particularly influence school leaders' experiences? How do leaders in these schools lead teaching and learning? And what does leadership learning look like in these schools? How do leaders relate to or interact with the social and cultural capitals of teachers and students? And I'm using S with a capital because I'm acknowledging the diversity of everybody in these schools. That is, we all know they're highly diverse and highly international. All right, I'm using a beautiful map, I hope, of the British Empire in the first half of the 1900s. And I'm kind of trying to establish this connection between the past of the colonial past, not only of the British Empire, that is strongly related to my own research, but also with the colonial past and how their movement to global South context has influenced and underpinned the development of international schools. That is also a call for thought. And if anyone is more interested in the historical relationship between British Empire and Qatar international schools or other Gulf international schools, I'm happy to share further resources by the end of the session or afterward. So there is a colonial history out there. In Qatar, colonial histories and economic policies have definitely underpinned the development of international schools. I'm not sure many people do know this, but the British Empire has colonized the Gulf for 150 years, which is a massive period of time that can actually shape people's perspectives and thinking, in addition to their social practice. And Qatar the agreement, or the protection agreement, has ended with Qatar in 1971. It was just a year or two before that has ended the agreement in Kuwait, and then the UAE came a little bit after that. So when I say the Gulf, it's because the political and economic context is quite unique to a great extent, although not 100%. The first British international school started in Qatar in 1971, and it is not just a coincidence that it was about the time of ending the protection agreement. It is called protection, but it's, in other words, it's a colonial relationship. There is a causal mechanism behind that, or beneath that. And I've also spoken about this in one of my interviews, and I've also developed it further in my research. So despite the rising number of American and European international schools, British international schools are still the majority in the Gulf, and particularly in Qatar. Some local schools obviously incorporate the term British in their marketing campaigns, and a lot of us are familiar with this. They describe their schools as British curriculum, British teachers, we have British leaders, etc. And this is pretty much to kind of hint or imply the quality of their services, because in the psyche, in the social construction of what British is in the Middle East, Britishness is quite associated with betterness or quality to some extent. So there's a lot of depth behind that, a lot of historical and sociological construction that has been happening around international schools. And I think when I hinted to the desirability phenomena, a lot of it is quite related to this part. The key features of international schools in Qatar are whiteness and Britishness, and particularly Englishness. There are mainly white men leaders. However, teachers are generally both men and women. It was interesting to note that all my case study schools have had white men as heads and white women as on the second rank, like that. Right, the deputies or the associate principals were white women. But it was probably in the leadership team would see one non-white leader that was quite interesting, because it was noticeable across the majority of the schools. And these schools are generally managed or overseen by Global North organizations. In England, of course, when England ended the protection agreement with the Gulf states, they maintained cultural and economic ties, and they encouraged massively the investments in multiple sectors, including obviously the oil and gas and education, because that agreement included developing cultural ties. And the British Council has played a massive role in that period between the 50s and the 1971. There was a crucial role for the British Council in the whole of the Middle East, but then it was centered more on the Gulf, where the oil at the beginning was flourishing since the 1938 or 1937. So Britain was obviously interested in maintaining these ties, and then later on, many of you who are familiar with British policies would note the developments that happened later on towards the late 90s, particularly with Blair and late Gordon, and all of that political discourse in England has been encouraging educational investors and schools to develop global partnerships and to expand services to expat communities in England. So it moved from going out there to global North countries to develop businesses, power relations, and other related areas, to encouraging local investors and local businesses to invest not only in education services overseas, but also in education services to create partnerships with expat communities or wealthy expats who are based in England, particularly England. Many independent schools in England invested in branches in the Gulf. There are many sister schools, and many of them also have developed massive full-on international programs to cater or to serve international students locally. However, they do not identify as international schools at all. They identify as traditional English independent schools, which is also, I think it also appeals to the desirability phenomena of people in the East who are very much interested in sending their children to gain some attributes of that Englishness, and particularly that relates to mannerisms and accent and other things. And the last point I wanted to make is that schools in England, international schools in England, host mostly international students, but generally local teachers and leaders, whereas in Qatar, schools have a variety of international students, and I wouldn't call it all international or all local because there is realistically a good mixture, but the locals are not referred to, do not really mean Qataris. The locals mean everyone who's quite from the Middle East. So in the discourse of her teachers, generally, they refer to students from the Middle East as locals, whereas those students are not really locals. Only Qataris are the locals according to Qatari laws and culture. So my research started with looking at leadership theory and also looking at the field. Because of my own background as a head teacher, I was quite interested in that area of social reproduction, how schools are expected to kind of maintain a specific socially appealing appearance rather than just focus on, obviously, on the education. So that is one of the burdens that international school leaders usually deal with. There are so many expectations by almost everyone. And I started looking at Bourdieu's social theory to kind of link the field or link the social environment to the leadership theory, or to what I know and what I'm planning to invest in examining leadership based on leadership theory. But soon, as soon as I started my data collection, and I did a mini pilot study before going into the full on research, tried kind of to test the waters and see what's out there for me. And I found out that there is a major gap that I was really not fully kind of trying to, I couldn't really connect the dots. There was a gap between what leaders do, what they know, their perspectives about learning, their perspectives about their students and the whole context, and the field and the needs of the field. And I wanted to really know where does that learning come from? What do they learn? What do they really have in mind, or what expectations are they expected to deliver when they come to these schools? So I started looking at leadership learning theory, and I think I found what I was looking for in critical andragogy, and I think that set of old school studies on a critical adult learning theory, especially that focus on leaders as adult learners and adult educators, because although their work is kind of conceptualized in most of the literature as adult educators, they are still adult learners. There's a lot to learn about how they learn, what is involved in their learning, and how do they do what they do. And I was looking at student-centeredness, Vivian Robinson's framework, and Jeff Southworth's learning-centeredness, because I was interested in the student in general, and how these schools really respond to students' needs, and how do they represent students' needs, but not the student as an individual, or not only in the studentship. I was interested in the student as a social being, as interested in people in general. And that is one of the areas that Bourdieu's theory was very useful. So it helped me to center the social, which is society, people, teachers, and students within the school, and offered me tools to analyze and develop my understanding of the field. So the notion of a Bourdieusian field enabled a nuanced analysis of the components and dynamics of these schools. And I attempted to, or I actually conceptualized schools as social and cultural fields. And the notion of the field isn't just a space or a place. It's loaded with the dynamics and the processes and the power relationship and who's in control of what, and the competitive relationships taking place. So there's a larger field of power, and there's a smaller social and cultural field that is the school. And most schools, or I would say all schools, at least in my own research, compete for position, compete for wealth, compete for competitiveness. So the field, it represents all these dynamics, all these relationships, and the struggle for power, not just the space, although they do represent also many elements of social and cultural factors within their spaces. The cultural and the social, and I've read a lot about how the culture goes back to heritage and artifacts and language histories and like histories of some indigenous communities and stuff. And I think after a lot of reading and a lot of researching and writing, I do disagree with that, because culture is strongly aligned, whatever we think is our culture, it is strongly aligned to our sense of identity. And it is practiced, it is lived, it's a part of what we do in our daily lives. So it's a part of people's, individuals' lives and social groups' lives. And that's why it is strongly connected with the social. And therefore, the cultural, I argue, is a key part of the social. And in my conceptualization of the social and cultural capital, I kind of disagree with some of the research also that looks at social capital as literally, they look at the words of what Bourdieu said about social capital, which is the size or the aggregate of someone's social network. Or some people go to that far to say it's the number of social connections and, the wealth of some social connections or the power. And I think that is in some sense correct. However, it is not enough, because people align or bond with other people, with other social groups based on factors that are linked to themselves. So I choose who I align to. I have something driving me to align to certain social groups. So what I'm trying to say is that people align with people who have shared interests, probably shared histories, shared knowledge, shared expectations. And it doesn't have to be within the same ethnic group or same religious group. And my research showed that interests have strongly bonded students together or brought people together. But it is important to establish at this stage of the presentation that the cultural and the social are strongly interconnected. And quite often I notice that everything that is written about cultural capital quite means different things to different people. So a lot of it sometimes kind of forgets that there is culture in the cultural capital. And I think that is important to highlight in this presentation. So theoretically speaking, cultural and social capitals are key parts of the social field, and the field influences leadership practice. That is, practice is conceptualized as agency, action, and learning habitus. So learning is a kind of constant development of the leader's habitus. The mobile field. And I think that is probably one of the very interesting areas that I came to towards the last part of my PhD. That field looked like it's constantly mobile. The only thing that was stable was probably the walls or that land, like everything was mobile. And obviously all the schools I've looked at, and I didn't include a methodology section because it's quite a rich conceptual presentation, but I did look at a survey of 49 schools where 49 principals took part, and I did look in depth at 5 case study schools, 3 in Qatar and 2 in England. So in that in-depth investigation, I interviewed head teachers, seniors, middle leaders, teachers, and high school students. I looked at document reviews, analyzed school evaluation reports, and I created a field analysis. I did like a kind of a scan research, a desk review research of the history of the schools and the type of governance, the nature, the identity, the programs, and so on. So the triangulation of all of these data sets together gave me a very thorough and deep understanding of the field I'm researching. The field is characterized by multiculturalism. All the schools I've looked at were highly multicultural, but it's mostly characterized by mobility. Everybody had the experience of mobility, and I'm referring here to geographical mobility. And when I started looking at the philosophy of mobility or the sociology of mobility, I came across a British sociologist, John Urry, who has a book called The Sociology of Mobility. And Urry's work was really interesting, although it is not in education, but I could adopt his concept into and use it in my own work. He calls for a shift from the study of the social as society to the study of the social as mobility. And I would say, why now? I was fascinated by that notion because I had already been working on mobility for about 2 years when I came across Uri's book. Everybody leaves, and students leave their home. They leave loved ones behind. They miss their first home. They come to a new place where people probably don't speak their language, or even if they do, the whole city, the whole town, the whole route to school looks unfamiliar. They take time to make friends, to make connections. Teachers too. Teachers take time to really feel that they're comfortable in the new workplace. It also applies to leaders. It applies to parents. So parents and many students have mentioned being unsettled yet because of visa issues, or some of them mentioned that they cannot go back to their home countries, particularly students from Iran, from Palestine, from Syria. And some of them mentioned that they are constantly in a state of permanent temporality. And that's why I'm distinguishing transience from mobility, because transience represents to that state of being in constantly temporal somewhere. And there are stateless communities in the Gulf, and I didn't know that before really. I knew that there were some issues with, or some Syrian and Palestinian families who have what is referred to as a document, a travel document. But I learned a lot from the students I've interviewed, and their longing for permanence was quite obvious, and that resonated with the sociology of mobility and identity that is heavily, deeply entrenched in that field. And then when I kept on looking at the data, I noticed that a lot of the people that code about moving or moving from one place to the other was quite heavy. A lot of leaders and teachers mentioned that they're moving in the next year, and some of them, they said they just moved to this school. So there is, I'm using Benson's revolving door, the notion here, and I noticed that there's heavy traffic at the revolving door. So this experience of analyzing all these experiences of mobility, transience, multiculturalism, I think they're quite heavy, and they influence the well-being and the learning experience of students particularly, and they do influence the experience of everyone in international schools. So based on this analysis, I called leadership to center, and I developed that kind of call or argument. So centering students' social needs, including, because the social includes also the emotional, includes the cultural. So these needs need to be centered in the whole thing that schools do, educational programs, a teaching program, process, practice, and everything the school does, because it's not trivial. It is not something external. It's central in the lives of people who go to these schools. Now, what about leaders? I guess that is an interesting part. Senior leaders in my study were generally focused on organizational goals, and by senior leaders, I also refer to heads and directors. So they're more concerned with the overall path of the school, including finances and strategic goals. However, middle leaders were fully focused on instructional areas. Most seniors work individually, while middle leaders work collaboratively, which, according to many of them, makes their work more successful and enjoyable. And I think that is really important and interesting, because I didn't have many bright areas in my research that really cheered me up while I was working and writing. But this collaborative work, the notion of working together and being more successful together, and the notion of joy was quite remarkable to note. And I would say why in a bit. There was also then a new emerging theme about formal and informal horizontal leadership. And I called it horizontal because a lot of my interviewees spoke about just starting up. They went to a program or learned something or tried something, and they wanted to start a movement, an initiative, and they brought some teachers together. So some of them did this by assignment, but many others did it without assignment. So teachers start what they call debates, after-school debates or after-school forum. And one school had a very early morning forum for teachers that were just coming and really self-organizing and sharing their own work. And that was noticeable, and that gave people some motivation to work. And I think that's really important to investigate further. The last important theme here on this slide is about what is working well, because I kept trying to find out something that is really seems rewarding and working well. the time spent speaking, interacting, and working alongside teachers and other leaders is the most effective. Particularly, that was evident during professional learning sessions, regardless of formal or informal professional learning sessions, working with team members, and generally in conversations at the school gate or in the hallways or in the playground, everywhere. So people did enjoy it, and leaders particularly mentioned that speaking to people, conversation made them feel more effective. They made them feel more useful, whereas a lot of the important and heavy work they do didn't particularly make them feel this way. This is quite common, I believe. At least researchers and school leaders would be familiar with the systemic and structural challenges. So while the world sees the shiny cover of the book, that is a metaphor for international schools, the inside is filled with stories of challenge and exhaustion. Leaders constantly navigate multiple demands by governors, inspectors, inspectors by government or other evaluating organizations, company executives, parents, and unsatisfied teachers and middle leaders who struggle with precarious conditions. So while we look at international schools and we see their website, it's like amazing, amazing work, fancy projects, really, state-of-the-art building and much more. Many teachers struggle with precarious conditions, and although some of them see this work as quite an opportunity, and they mention, like, I was lucky to have this job, but the uncertainty around the job is quite serious. And I think Tristan and Adam have expanded on this concept in their work. There are financial restrictions, and many schools manage their finances by cutting jobs and wages and restraining resources, which also adds another pressure on teachers and middle leaders who are focused on making the teaching process work. Staff and teachers are generally overworked, and I think leaders too. So leaders, in addition to being exhausted and overworking, leaders constantly attempt to motivate people, and I think that's an additional burden on what leaders do. They want to constantly encourage people, motivate people, even those with delayed wages, even those with insecure jobs. And that is obviously an additional burden on leaders. Exhaustion was common. Leadership is a complex process that requires cognitive focus and both physical and emotional energy. However, the increasing demands generally limit this process. Leaders engage in different battles concurrently, which can be daunting to their well-being and their decision-making skills. And when it wasn't said explicitly, it was noted or it was concluded from the comments of different leaders in the same school and the comments of teachers. So when leaders hinted something they're doing or hinted that they're having a meeting, for example, with management to negotiate contracts or negotiate resources, it was just a reflection of how, they're trying to keep it together, but they're also affected by these conditions. Leaders rarely have time to reflect and reevaluate their work in relation to the social and cultural elements of their schools. And that was an important question in my research, because the relating to, or the relationship between leaders and the social and cultural capital and the social and cultural needs of the field was clear and was one of my questions to leaders. But I think it was absent. It was predominantly absent in their work. They didn't really have time to think about that because they were so busy doing many other things. Curriculum, obviously, curriculum and pedagogy were also another important area. Curriculum was generally designed outside the school walls and delivered by teachers whose experiences and knowledges are generally excluded from their teaching practice. And I'm referring to a lot of things teachers mentioned about when they described how exciting they were to come to these schools, and the moment they stepped in, orientation programs started, and they received guidance packages, instruction packages, and a lot of that shaping and molding teachers' practice. And while and I was a head teacher, and I know that this is not only normalized, we see this as good practice. And I do believe that teacher preparation and guidance in the job and on the job is really important. However, because I was looking at the cultural capital, and which includes also in my own conceptualization, it does include the teacher's professional capital, because it's a part of their own career, it's a part of their own life choice. So that was all kind of packaged and left behind, left outside the school wall. So teachers came with a good CV and a lot of formal training, a lot of knowledge previously, a lot of professional values, but that was just not acknowledged. It wasn't there. It wasn't brought up to the table. It felt alienating. It was a process of kind of misrepresenting or underrepresenting both students and teachers, because the school had everything ready. The school values were on the walls, were on the books, were everywhere. Everyone, particularly leaders, they did speak massively about the school values, the school goals, mission, vision, strategic goals, and how their own way. For example, there was, I'm not going to use names, so I will give examples. We see in the media on international schools, like the Sabbath way, the GEMS way, the so on way. There's a lot of things, the brand, and it was an overwhelming discourse coming to this depth, lengthy research that my data collection lasted more than 18 months. And I was kind of invested in really looking at all these dynamic cultural and social elements in these schools, but then seeing that, or hearing and reading my transcripts and reflecting on the overwhelming narrative provided by the school. That is really, it felt like it's just the school's story, but there's nobody else's story in there. So everything they do from the gate to their social media accounts, to their classrooms, is pretty much the school's brand, the school's story and narrative, but not everyone else. Everybody else has been made to fit in within that discourse. Belonging was another factor. So students did bring these words about not belonging. I didn't belong here. It took me long to belong, and so on. But what wasn't said by teachers, who were extremely respectful of their teachers and of their leaders and school environment, but that sense of alienation when they described that their own cultural capital or social capital didn't feel that they really mattered to the school, and they had to kind of blend in. It felt that alienation was connected to a sense of disbelonging, and that belonging requires obviously more than connecting with a few friends or being acquainted with a few others. It's more about creating that safe and inclusive spaces and brokering boundaries where people actually matter, not only their nationalities and names, because head teachers spoke massively about how many nationalities they have, or sometimes they called each other by I noted that they called some other people by their nationalities, and they were really proud of that. I think that's interesting. But I felt that the full being, the presence of students and teachers wasn't there. It was just that we have teachers from this who taught in Moscow, and teachers who taught in Egypt, and teachers who taught somewhere else. But it was nothing about the teachers themselves, or even the students themselves. So the identity divide was huge. The invisibility of cultural capital of hundreds or thousands of students and many teachers reproduces a social and cultural rupture that underpins many current issues in international schools. And I would again say, at least in the school that I have deeply examined. And I think there was a kind of invisible hierarchy of cultures and nationalities and backgrounds and languages and accents and economic capital and a lot more. So there was a description of the different programs some students went to and different products or projects that they engage in, but it was more about really not the students or not the cultures or not the knowledge, it was just about setting a record, important record of what the school wants them to do, but it wasn't really about them. My interviews with students are quite interesting and rewarding, I would say. Students raised questions of identity and disbelonging. They had multiple experiences of internationalization, which were quite distinct based on their experiences. They also raised questions of being not being seen, not being visible, not being represented. So that issue of misrecognition of their own social and cultural capital and their invisibility were quite obvious. There was a misrepresentation of students at different levels in the school environment, curriculum, pedagogy, and also the recruitment policy. Some students mentioned that they don't really see teachers or staff looking like them. However, in Qatar, there were a minority of teachers who would speak Arabic, and those were the teachers of the Arabic language that is taught once or twice, and the teachers of Qatar history and Islamic studies. And in many cases, it was the same teacher teaching all of this, or two teachers teaching all of this. So it was really a minority. Students who are obviously Gen Zs are critically aware of systemic and wider global inequities. They demand change and much more representation and recognition in their own schools. So I'll go back to the theory, the theoretical and practical gaps in the field. There is a gap between leaders' practice, what leaders do, and the needs of their field. And by the field or the needs, I'm always referring to social and cultural needs, because it's embedded in our educational experiences, and it's not aside, it's not something extra. And there is a gap between what they learn and what they do. So leaders explicitly and clearly mentioned that they were not prepared to lead in this field. They applied for jobs and they were chosen based on a massive multiple round assessment process, but they were not prepared to lead internationally. And many of them haven't visited this area before or have worked, for example, in Egypt or in another country, but that is not necessarily related to the context in which they're working in. Most leaders have had, or I would say 10% of the participants in my research had leadership qualifications, but obviously all of them had their own undergrad degrees in different subjects, and most of them came from teachers, except for one who has been an administrator or was an administrator for a very long time, and they had broad contextual awareness. Learning to lead in this context was quite heavy, and based on these interviews, I started looking further at what leadership learning looks like and what does it mean, and the gaps in that area. So there is a lack of preparation, obviously, for internationalization and multiculturalism in leadership. And while some leaders come from schools in England or other countries where they refer to them as diverse and multicultural schools, but I think international schools are quite different because it's both the internationalization and the multiculturalism. And the internationalization incorporate a lot of the mobility and a lot of the huge diversity aspect and a lot of that sense of transience, which makes people's experiences quite different. There's a heavy focus on organizational goals and leadership learning programs. There's a lot of attention to the organizational identity or branding, as they called it, the performative aspects of schooling, and a lot of meeting accreditation requirements or being ready for inspection and so on, as many head teachers in this room would be familiar with. The needs and capitals of students and the broader social field were absent in leaders' knowledge. And I think I've quoted these ones in my thesis. I think it was quite surprising to some extent to hear school leaders saying that when I particularly asked about capital, about student capital and leadership and teacher capital and the social and the cultural capitals particularly, some of the answers ranged from, oh, we do their capital. We kind of mold and shape their capital. And they were so proud that they're crafting that capital. And I'm aware that schools do a lot for students, but hang on, like, do these people come to your school with no capital? What happened before that? It just, it was just surprising and quite problematic to engage in a discourse that is so focused on organizational development. And obviously those leaders are very hardworking and very intelligent people. However, the system they are blended in, or they made to blend in or blend with, is more about making that school shine and making that school work as an organization. But there is obviously a missing element that is the social and the cultural capital of people. So leaders didn't know about that. They didn't really think that is really important. And that absence was to a researcher like me quite important and significant. So I did develop on that. I did dig deeper into trying to find where that absence come from and why and so on. And many leaders did speak fondly of their students. They do love the students. They are so proud of their teachers. However, they are so proud of the students because they're blending in very well. They're being able to really adapt to the school curriculum and the school. They were so proud of them. But that also told me something about the student-centeredness, where it only means that schools really make sure that students fit in with their agenda rather than making something to really adapt or change even the framework of how they do their schooling process, how they teach to fit or to accommodate for all these multiple needs. So students' needs were only mentioned in with reference, for example, to students who have some learning disabilities or difficulties, but not at all when it relates to student multiple languages, for example, or students coming from a different system and different culture, different context, and all of that. So the theory or the theoretical investigation I was doing parallel to my data analysis has kind of helped me to bridge these two areas together. I was looking at what kind of theory, what sort of theoretical engagement really relates to bridge that gap. And when I expanded my analysis after the third round of analysis, when I did horizontal analysis and vertical analysis, I looked at the findings from each school together and looked at the data starting with the head teacher to students. And then I looked at what head teachers said across all 5 schools, what teachers and middle leaders said across all 5 schools, and then again what students said. And I could find very common themes, and that gave me more the confidence to expand further. So that transformative learning theory, particularly starting with Mezirow and a part of Habermas' communicative action theory, was also helpful in understanding how that bridge could be. And also, I'm a researcher of leadership. I come from a leadership background, so I wanted to really engage in construct some steps that could help me understand and then probably write something about this in my thesis. So transformative learning in my own thesis means going through these steps. It means engaging with relevant theory and literature that has been quite absent to some extent or probably not given the needed attention. And that could mean a lot of things. That could mean learning a lot about the context, learning about cultural theory, learning about social needs, about social aspects of schools, learning about what it means for a school to exist in a specific context and where that history comes from. And many interviewees didn't really know anything about the history of the country in which they lived. They just engaged with the probably the very common bit that that newcomers know, but not really much. And I think that's really important. And then they need to immerse themselves in cultural and societal discourses. So learn from the field, speak to people, speak to students, speak to teachers who come from different countries, really learn about them, what kind of value is embedded in their own professional capital and how that can contribute to the school. And it could probably bring a lot of asset to the school. And then the critical reflection bit was really important. So leaders need to critically reflect on what they already know, what their own journey has looked like, and how it could relate or not relate to this field in which they're working. But it's not only that kind of intellectual critical reflection or professional practice in international reflection. It's also about deconstructing their own prior knowledge and attitudes about the other. There was a sense of othering in quite a few interviews, and I would say it was almost dominant. The way people spoke about the students and communities had included that bit of Edward Said othering, and it was quite important to note and develop, because it felt like there are also feelings of othering when students spoke about being not seen or not represented. And some teachers did mention that too, particularly teachers from multiple contexts, global majority or global context. So there were some kind of historical feeling. I would describe this as really a feeling, historical feeling of othering that resulted from that historical colonial practice. And that is not something to be excluded or ignored in social and educational research. And I believe that is really important to highlight or acknowledge and confront ourselves as leaders or as people in the field, researchers in the field. It is important to reflect on how the colonial practice has made people and their grandparents or probably intergenerational feelings. How did that look like? What does it mean? And what do students know about it? And when I spoke about the dominant narrative, the school story, in many cases, students learned British history, or in one school they learned American history. For example, there was an option of learning multiple histories. It was called world history, for example. And that didn't really acknowledge anything about the colonial history, but I'm more concerned about people's memories, people's knowledges. And that's why I use knowledge in plural, because people have multiple knowledges. And I do believe that international schools, in that multicultural attribute that they are representing in many communities, they need to really open up and reflect on how they're involving different perspectives and different stories. And I don't think we can ignore what is happening in the Middle East when we think of different perspectives, because violence doesn't just happen, when we press a button. Violence happens because of a shift of perspective or a denied perspective, and a lot of multiple misrecognition process on the way. And that is not obviously it would be too heavy to all that school, to say that school leaders have all that responsibility to make people really coexist and understand each other's histories and perspectives. But it is also one of the areas that school leaders need to be prepared to lead, particularly those leading in difficult contexts. But throughout this process of engagement, immersion, critical reflection, and deconstruction, action is needed. And action, according to Habermas, leads to acts of respect and solidarity. And that leads to a kind of shift from an individual learning journey of leaders to a collective, where they would lead, and here they would lead other teachers and leaders, and they would lead organizational development. And that's why leaders are indeed adult learners and adult educators who guide the learning of other people. And I think this model quite represents what I've just said. So the individual journey, or moving from individual learning to collective learning, goes through all these circles. The leader as an adult learner, then they go into a process of transformative learning, the leader as adult educator, and learning for social and cultural justice, leading for social and cultural justice at an organizational level. I hope this shape also represents everything that came out of my research, that that interconnection, or the small arrows, the tiny arrows, represent how everything in this oval that is the school field kind of needs to be informed, at least, and needs to be learning from the other areas. So student capital and learning are important, and they also need to feed teachers' knowledge and teachers' capital and learning, and that also should feed into leadership practice. Leadership learning is also connected and needs to be all connected to each other. It is not just, and by this oval, I'm calling to kind of abandon that top-bottom approach, where the school is doing great and like really highly popular and well desirable and has amazing records, and the students have amazing records, but then there's a model that everybody else needs to learn from and perform accordingly. And I'm kind of shifting that into understanding the school as a circular, interconnected, relational space where people learn from each other. And it's not enough just to give instruction for the learning to happen. It's important for that relationality to be a process of engagement. So leaders learn from the field. They also contribute to the development of the field, and they guide that learning process. And everybody, in some sense, should be learning from each other and learning from the field, and also working on developing the school as a social field. And these important areas on the side were the key themes that emerged from my analysis, and I believe I have mentioned them one way or the other. Learning from theory and contextual knowledge, dialogue and speaking to other people and conversations, recognition and representation of people's cultural and social capitals, and knowledge, traditions and histories and languages. Social and cultural responsive, socially and culturally responsive pedagogy is also important, because teachers bring a lot of important value and important knowledge. And also the school needs to respond somehow, at least in some sense, to reflect the ways people learn, because when people speak a different language at home, it's not just words, language is more a way of communicating their feelings, communicating their ideas, and it's also a way of living. So by responding to students pedagogically, it would be important to represent all these ways of communication. And that applies to adapting the curriculum to be more responsive and building on trust relationships and critical reflection. Conclusions. I have to say thank you for being patient, but I swear this is the last one. A critical sociological perspective, like the one I adopted in my own research, questions the widely established assumptions about the quality and legitimacy of international schools and their success stories. And this is not to say that there is no quality, but it depends upon how relevant this quality is. And what do we do with this quality after we graduate from these schools? And many of international school students graduate to become leaders in their countries, in politics, in economy, in the industries, and sometimes in the military. So it's really important to probably shift our perspective of the role of international schools from maybe teaching for employability and high tech and highly rated university admissions and stuff. I think that is it's equally important and relevant to really think also of what that community needs. Critiquing international schools is not a stance against them in any way, but a call for the hope they could represent in a highly polarized world. And I have to note that this also relates to schools in England, not just in Qatar or the Middle East in general, because many or the majority of students in schools I examine in England come from the Swana region, that is South, West Asia, and North Africa. And West Asia is the Middle East. Because West Asia is a term used by the people of the land, whereas Middle East is used by, it has been used by the British troops in that colonial phase. So it is important to really acknowledge that the social and cultural needs could be different, but they are also important and need to be embedded in the school practice. The world needs schools where classrooms are spaces of intellectual and moral confrontations and dialogue, rather than dismissing difficult conversations. And I think it's about time to start not hiding or not suppressing difficult topics or difficult conversations in international schools, and particularly in the Middle East, because it's about time that we open up and speak and listen from all of us, from everyone, their own stories and their narratives, and probably teach people how to disagree in peace and how to coexist with different perspectives. And I think this is what the world needs most at this time. Thank you so much. I'm going to stop sharing. Thank you. I hope it wasn't very heavy and very lengthy.
Thank you very much. Yeah, so we don't have much time left now for questions, but thank you very much for that. That was a lot of information for us all to take in on this Friday morning, but I think we got that. I mean, I've got a couple of questions, but I don't want to go first. Does anybody else, would anybody else like to ask Nidal a question while we have her here? Okay, well, oh, Bernie. Okay, go on then, Bernie. Still muted. No, can't hear you. Okay, well, while you're working out how to unmute, I'll ask my question, shall I? Okay, so I found it very interesting. A lot of the work that you're doing resonates a lot with me, because it's analogous to the work that I've done as well in the schools. I posted a little link. At some point, I was convinced of this idea of these schools being in permanent transition. And that is the defining factor of these schools, is that they are permanently trans. And then I worked for the British Army for a while, and I taught leadership at Sandhurst. And I made so many parallels there to international schools. It was quite devastatingly interesting, because in the army, it's command and control, right? For 1% of the time in the army that you're leading, it's utter chaos and terror, and everything is going wrong. Nobody can communicate. And then people, I've seen them do it when explosions are going off. They just shout at each other, and people are all bemused and dumb, and it's quite aggressive, but it gets things done. And for the other 99% of the time, all the soldiers are sitting around in base with nothing to do. And then it's about building teams and nurturing and being kind and collegial and looking after families. And it reminds me a lot of international schools when you're posted off to your space, and that's where you are. So there's this interesting collision and collusion, to take Bourdieu's words, of transactional power and transformational power. How international schools tend to push leaders towards being transactional leaders, but they have to cloak this within a transformational framework, because otherwise the stakeholders won't buy in. The transition of the organization is so powerful that there's no other way to lead in it other than being transactional. You've got to get things done, and people are going to be gone by the end of the year. But at the same time, you can't do that because of the nature of the organization. That's my comment. And my question now is the gaze. You were talking about how people feel in these schools, how students feel unobserved and unseen and invisible. And yet the schools are responding to a market demand, which is asking them to be what they are. Have you ever thought of I mean, we've probably done this already, but, you know, Foucault's original idea of the gaze, and then developed as it is in feminist studies, and then through into post-colonial studies, the idea of the gaze or the post-colonial gaze. How do you see that playing a role in these schools?
Thanks, Alex. I think, yeah, that's really important. And I agree with what you said about the transactional nature of the organization. But to come to the gaze, I think that is a very strong point. And I would, that's why I mentioned students as a generation, and while generational theory might not be 100% applicable all the time, but there is a new awareness now. So the first generation, the parents' generation, generally from the Middle East, they kind of compete and they line up and sign up years before to really get their kids into international schools, because of the historical and political reason. There is a massive history of instability and lack of opportunities and political chaos in the Middle East. So people desperately want better opportunities for their children. And while they still see that internationalization or international school kind of figure, or the Britishness in international schools or Americanness, while these parents still see it as an asset to their children, those young people are now more aware that they can and they should demand change. I think they're doing better than us.
Thank you. That's really helpful. So the parents are in this situation of the ones who are gazed upon, who are responding to what they perceive to be the power advantage of the international school, because it, in their eyes, will afford them power and influence in the world. However, the children, the youth, take a different view of it and see that their own power comes from themselves, their own identities and their own backgrounds. Thank you. Very helpful. Stephen.
Made it. Nidal, thank you so much for all the insights here. The international schools is not a research interest or specialism of mine, but it's a real teaching interest of the program that Alex mentioned at the start. I've been working with so many master's students who are doing research in their roles in international schools as they study our education leadership program. And the line that you used there, while the world sees the shiny cover, the inside is filled with stories of challenge and exhaustion. And that's exactly what many of these master's dissertation inquiry projects are about. It really spoke to me, that did. I did want to mention one thing. You had a line on one of your slides which was almost a throwaway line. I thought it was brilliant. And the line was, senior leaders work individually while middle leaders work collaboratively. It made me want to rush off and do a research project on that. I think that's great. Could you say a little more about what your evidence was for that and what you found out about that?
Yeah, thank you for bringing this up. And I think it was one of the, a colleague of mine said, you can probably frame it more theoretically when you speak. And I said, no, I'm going to keep it in the same way they said it, because the nature of the headship job or the headship role is quite lonely. They are made to feel that they are like kind of the sole decision maker, and they're the most important people in schools. And there's a heavy burden that comes along with that, because parents look up to them to solve difficult problems, to respond to demands. Teachers and leaders, everybody looks up to them to find solutions. But they, if they want to phone or email one of the governors or the board, probably it's a lengthy process. And if they, even their seniors, the people next in line, they look up to them for solutions. And they said that in many cases, they find themselves after school hours just in their office thinking and wondering about how to find a solution to that. And I just wanted to give them a hug, actually. It was so emotional because I could identify with that as a former head teacher in my 7 years of headship. I think that's really, it could resonate with every head teacher I know. There was one school in England where there were two co-head teachers, a woman and a man, and I felt that it really made a difference to how that head teacher felt, because they do speak all the time and they make decisions together. So I think there was something to learn from that experience.
Thank you.
Fantastic.
I'm unmuted now, if I can.
Oh, well done, Maria. Off you go.
Yeah, the problem is that I couldn't find a cursor, so
All
sorry
right.
about that. Nidal, congratulations, great presentation. I wanted to ask you, when you were talking about the lack of sense of belonging, how do you think curricula that is so prescribed, like the International Baccalaureate, for example, whether it's an enabler to help with that, or whether it's actually it's worse, it hinders or feeds on that lack of belonging? Thanks,
Bernie. That's a really good question that some of the students have mentioned in their interviews. I think there's the experience of having just moved to a new place, and the curriculum is so competitive and so demanding. The IB program is so demanding, and it just doesn't really give students a lot of space to socialize and to really get comfortable. So the moment, I think from some of them mentioned having tough assignments from the first week or two, and that is really, I mean, that competitiveness aspect does affect how students feel, and they are made to feel that they need to compete in order to kind of survive, because the attention and the recognition is more for those who are doing very well. I think that is a tough area that students battle with, and there isn't much attention probably given enough in these schools to that area of belonging and what helps students in settling down and being really a part of the organization before catching up on tough work and high stakes exam preparation.
Thank you. So, colleagues, I'm going to have to start rounding us off a little bit. We're 5 minutes over our already 1 hour, 15-minute session. Thank you for your questions and comments. Very, very helpful. Thank you too for Belmas for hosting us today. That's excellent. This has been a long time waiting for this here, Nidal. We've been expecting this and wishing for this for a long time, and it's lovely to hear about your research. We expect to see now a flurry of publications coming out that we can all avail ourselves of. I refer you to Nidal's Google Scholar site, please. If you Google her on Google Scholar, you will find her publications as they are now coming out, and you can avail yourselves of them. If you want direct access to them, please email Nidal directly. Your email is at the University of Ulster, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So you'll find her at the University of Ulster. I'll just hand over to Tristan briefly.
Yeah, thank you very much, Nidal. I liked the conclusions. I agree with the conclusions. This issue about we're critiquing international schools, but we're doing it in a positive way. We're not being critical. It's just many of us know that and feel that international schools have potential, and we want them to fulfil their potential. So that's why we're critical, isn't it? So I think that's worth bearing in mind. Thank you.
Yeah, that really important role of the critical friend. It's always great when you've got friends around who continually tell you how great you are, but that leads you to becoming a rather ineffective and probably unhappy person at the end of the day, doesn't it? You do need those friends who tell you the truth, and hopefully that's what this research group is as well. We are the friends of international schools and the International Baccalaureate who can just tell the truth to make them be the best that they can be. And I think your contribution is absolutely sits firmly within that there. So thank you again. Dr. Nidal, colleagues, thank you for coming. I wish you all a lovely weekend when you get there, and see you again soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much to everyone who attended, and to Belma's team. And thanks, Tristan and Alex. It was fantastic. I really enjoyed sharing my research with you. Enjoyed the questions. Thank you all. And we do, I think we do need to move on from the critique to what's next, what we can do, because international schools are much needed, and we need these in multicultural spaces. We're probably thinking beyond that. Looking forward to my publications, upcoming publications.
Lovely. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks
Have
a
a
lot.
lovely day and weekend ahead.
Thank you, everyone. I've got to go to my thing. So
Bye.
bye-bye.